this week we're going to continue on where we left off last week, where we were looking at JavaScript, and I did mention that we would look at jQuery. So the notes for this week are sort of split up across week 6 and week 7 on my blog. So there's a bit of information on jQuery here under week 6. And then there's some information about Jquery Ui and Jquery Plugins on the week 7 notes. Okay, but I'll start off with just talking about jQuery first of all. So you can find the jQuery website at jquery.com, and I guess we should talk first of all about what exactly is jQuery. So jQuery is a JavaScript library, and all that means is it is a bunch of JavaScript code that provides some functions that when we include the jQuery library in our project, that we can call them just like functions that we had written ourselves. So really all the jQuery library is a JavaScript file, and we include that in our project, and then in our own JavaScript we basically call the functionality of jQuery. It's not the only JavaScript library. There are others out there, but this has become very much the most popular one, and so for that and various other reasons, it's the one we're going to look at. It's probably the best one to start with anyway. So let's see. So why do we need jQuery? Well, technically we don't strictly need it, but we use it because it makes certain things a lot easier. So things to do with selecting of elements in the document object model, jQuery makes that a lot easier. And it implements it in such a way that if you understand how to write a CSS selector, then you understand how to write a Jquery selector. It uses the same syntax as we use for CSS. So in a way, if you already know how to write CSS, then you're a good way to knowing how to use jQuery. The other thing that it gives us is it deals with some of the inconsistencies that different browsers have, particularly older browsers have with implementations of JavaScript. So while it's not so much of an issue anymore, there have been issues where different browsers will actually interpret the same JavaScript code differently. So jQuery deals with some of those cross-browser inconsistencies for us without us having to do our own workarounds. And also it provides a plugin architecture so that, as we'll see later, we can leverage any of the thousands of jQuery plugins that are out there to basically do a lot of work for us without much effort on our part. But we'll look at that in a little bit. So how we include jQuery in our project is, well, there's two ways essentially. And if we look at this download link here, before I do that, sorry, I should just mention there's a link here to the API documentation, okay, which will give you which will describe all of the functions that jQuery has and what they do, and will give you code examples of how to use them. So I'll be referring to that as I go through my examples as well. But in terms of actually installing or including jQuery, I'm going to go to the download link here. And you'll notice there's a whole bunch of links here. But essentially they're all variations of the same thing. So first of all, it's split up into version 1 and version 2 of jQuery. Version 2, basically, as it says here, they've just dropped support for older browsers, Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8, just to make the library a bit smaller. But if you want to make sure that you're still supporting all of those older browsers, then you can stick with jQuery version 1. So just within this version, okay, there's a few different links here. The only two that we really need to worry about are these. Is this one here, the compressed production jQuery or the uncompressed development jQuery. So if I look at the uncompressed development one first of all, if I click this, okay, you'll notice that it is literally just a JavaScript file. Okay, so there's a bunch of JavaScript in here. So this is what jQuery looks like. It's just a whole bunch of JavaScript code and functions. Okay, and we'll be calling those functions to do various different things. So that's what the development version looks like. And then in order to save a little bit of space, make the file a little bit smaller and therefore make our website a little bit faster, generally you find all these libraries also have a minified version or a compressed version. If we look at that, okay, it's the exact same file, but it's just gotten rid of any of the spaces and formatting. Okay, so it just saves a little bit of file size by smashing it all together like that. So functionally, it doesn't really matter which one you use, but I tend to use the compressed version just because it's a little smaller, and you're meant to end up using that version anyway. But if for any reason you do want to look at the actual code, then you probably want to use the development version. Not that you'll probably really need to go in and look at the jQuery code. So I'm going to download this one here, the compressed version. I'm going to just save that file. And I'm going to put it in a folder, just an empty folder that I've got here set up for these exercises. I'm going to save that. Okay, and so there's the JavaScript file there. That's the jQuery file. And I guess I'm going to need an HTML page to demonstrate something, so I'll just create that. So we'll just call this jQuery.html. Okay, and essentially I just include this in the same way that I would include, that I would link to my own external JavaScript file. Okay, so if you remember from last week, there was two ways that we could write JavaScript. We could either write a script tag like this, okay, and then write some JavaScript code in here, or we would write a script tag like this with a source attribute and link to an external JavaScript file. So something like this. Okay, so I might just create a directory here just to be consistent with last week called JS, where I'm going to put my JavaScript files. Okay, but in this case, what I want to do to include jQuery is basically do exactly this, but I'm going to link to that jQuery file that I've downloaded here. So I've got that in a folder called JS, and then there's the name of the jQuery file. So that there is all I have to do to include the jQuery library in my project. Now, I also mentioned last week that the order of how you, where you put your JavaScript is important. It actually matters. So if I'm to go and write my own script now which uses jQuery, then it's important that I include jQuery before I write my custom script. Okay, so this could be my custom script here, so I'll just write a comment here, include jQuery. Okay, and then here's my custom script here. So I would do something like, so a statement that I could use to test whether jQuery exists is to do something like console.log window.jQuery. Okay, now if I run this, you'll notice that I get some output here. Okay, so this is actually returning me the jQuery function in my console.log. Now, if I happen to put my custom script, so my script, if I happen to put this before I include jQuery, okay, then you'll see that it outputs as undefined. So what this means is that if I have any code that uses jQuery, I need to make sure that comes after I've included jQuery. So generally jQuery is always the first script that you will include, and then you may include other libraries, and then finally the last thing you include is your own custom JavaScript. Now there is one other way that we can include jQuery in our file, and that is to link directly to the jQuery file on what's called a content delivery network, or a CDN. Okay, so back here on the jQuery download page, you can see here it says using jQuery with a CDN, with a content developer network. So a content developer network is simply just a server which is designed to store common files and libraries that people use. And there's various advantages of it, including speed, including you not having to actually download the file itself. But essentially you're doing the same thing. Okay, you're linking to the JavaScript file, but it just happens to be on an external web server. So for example, if I want to use the version on Google's Content Developer Network, I can click here, find the jQuery. Okay, you'll see they have a whole bunch of different libraries that you can include. Okay, but here's the jQuery one, and they give you the code snippet which you need to copy. So I'll copy that over to my example. Okay, and so as you can see, it basically is still just including this jQuery file, but it's including it from ajax.googleapis.com. Now, there is one little caveat with this. If you're testing your page, so if I remove this one here, if you're testing your page from your local hard drive, which I'll do here, okay, then you'll notice I get an error here where it says failed to load, it says file not found. Okay, when trying to load that. Now the reason that is because they haven't specified a protocol here at the beginning. They haven't put HTTP here. And the reason they do that is so that it works when it is on a web server with either HTTP or HTTPS, which is a secure connection. But the only issue is if you're testing off your local machine, it's going to default to assuming that the protocol is file like this, so it's going to look for it it's not going to look for it on the web server. The easiest way to fix that is simply just to add the HTTP back in there. Okay, and then there's no error, and that works again. Now what you might see done is actually a combination of both of these two methods, where you include jQuery from the content developer network, but if that's not available for some reason, maybe if you're offline, then it has a fallback to the local version. Okay, so that looks something like this, and it doesn't really matter whether you do this or not, but I'm just showing you so you don't get confused when you see it in examples. So basically what this is saying is, let's write a comment here, so include jQuery from CDN with local fallback. Okay, so what this is doing is trying to include the jQuery from the Google server, and then this script here is basically seeing if the jQuery object exists, and if it doesn't, then it's writing basically that local script tag into the document. So I just need to put the path to my local one here, local version of jQuery. So that gives us both options. Now functionally it really doesn't matter which or both that you use. If you want to use the Google one, that's fine, the content delivery network one, that's fine, or if you want to use the local one, that's also fine. Either will work. I've just done this to show you that is possible to do both ways, and you might see that in examples. Okay, so we've included jQuery in our document, but we haven't actually done anything with it yet. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is, I'll just get the jQuery documentation back here. Okay, so there is a function called ready. Okay, so this function here, and you can see down here the code for it looks like this. Basically what this function does is make sure that your code isn't executed until the page is fully loaded and ready to go. Okay, so if we're doing things like, if I have some HTML in this page, so I'll just create some here. Alright, let's copy this back from my completed example. Okay, so this is my page with just some HTML content, okay, a couple of headings, some divs which I've styled to look like colored boxes, and an image and some buttons. Okay, there's no JavaScript happening here yet. But let's just say I've got these elements on the page. If I've got my script up here and I'm attempting to access them before these are loaded, then it's not going to know what I'm talking about. So that's the whole reason that we use the document.ready function. It basically delays the execution of the script until the page is fully loaded and ready to be interacted with. So it looks like this. Okay, so the $sign is the jQuery object. Okay, so anytime we're using a jQuery selector, it will start with the $sign. Okay, and then we're saying get the document, so the whole browser object, and then when it's ready, do the code that we put inside of this function. Okay, so we declare a function here, and we put all our code inside of here, which we want to execute when the page is loaded. Okay, so so I can put an alert inside here, for example. So ready to go. Alright, and that will only be executed when the page is fully loaded. Okay, so there we go. So if I do it without this, I should see the alert pop up, okay, and then like this. Okay, so if I'm attempting to select something within the page, I need to wait until the content itself is actually loaded. So that's why generally always you'll see jQuery code is put inside this document.ready function. Okay. Alright, so let's look at the first part of jQuery, which is selecting elements. And actually, the best way of demonstrating this is actually to use the JavaScript console in the browser. So I can actually type in, as I think I've shown you before, I can type in JavaScript in here, so I can put an alert, okay, and that will actually execute when I hit return. So as long as I've got jQuery in my page, I should be able to access the jQuery object as well. Okay, so I can do things like jQuery selectors here. So let's just say, okay, I want to let's just say I want to select all of the paragraphs on this page. Okay, then I can write a jQuery selector that looks like, let's see if I can make this bigger. Just zoom in here. So I can write a jQuery selector that looks like this. Okay, start with the $sign. Now this $sign is actually a function. Okay, it's actually a legitimate function name. It just means the jQuery function. So inside these parentheses, we pass it a parameter, and the parameter that we pass it is, well, we can pass it a string that is essentially a CSS selector which will point to an element or elements on the page. So if I want to select all of the paragraphs on the page, I simply just pass it P like that. Okay, and then if I hit return, you'll notice that it shows me all of the paragraphs that it's selected. Okay, one by one, there they all are. Okay, so I can select elements. So I can select anything that is a div element. Okay, there's a div, all of these things are all divs. Okay, I can also use it to select IDs. Okay, so in my HTML here, alright, I've got basically two articles here, okay, and they each have an ID, Article 1 and Article 2. Okay, so I can select one of those by saying hashtag. Okay, so we're using the CSS syntax again here. So for an ID it's hash article 1. Alright, and that should just select me the first of those articles. Okay, there it is. Okay, and then I could do article 2. Alright, now I can also use classes. I can select things based on a class. So let's say, for example, these boxes here, okay, they all have a class of square. Okay, they've got a class of square and then a second class which styles them with a different color. So I could select all of the squares on the page by writing a selector like this. So again, using the CSS syntax for class.square. Okay, and there we go, that's selected all of my squares. Now let's just say I only want to select the red square that's inside of Article 1. Okay, so I don't want to select both red squares, just the red square inside of Article 1. So I can write that as well, and it would be just like how I would target that using a CSS selector again. So it would be hash article 1 space dot square dot red. Okay, I mean we'll do it with just dot square first. Alright, and that will return us, okay, just 1, 2, 3. Okay, just the 3 squares inside of article 1. But if I have dot square dot red, okay, then it returns just the red square inside of article 1. Okay, so this is saying inside of article 1, get me the element that has both classes square and red. So anything you can write as a CSS selector, you can write as a Jquery selector. So that's why it's really handy, because if you already know how to write CSS selectors, then you know how to write Jquery selectors. Okay, so alright, let's see, what will we do next? Okay, we can also okay, so we've done selectors, alright, but we haven't actually changed anything on the page. So generally we select something so that we can manipulate it in some way, so that we can change something. So let's just say I want to change the color of this red square here to green. So in order to do that, I can if I come up here, so the reason that it's red is because it has a class called red. Okay, so if I want to change it to green, I can just change that class to green. Okay, and it becomes green. Now we can do that with jQuery by using, first of all, and I'll write this code now inside of my own script. So first of all, I want to select the red square in article 2. So I'll write my selector, which looks like this. Hash article 2 space dot square dot red. I guess it's the only square in article 2, so I could just say dot square. What I'll do then so that's selected it. This line has selected it, okay? Now I could store this as a variable, so I can say variable equals that selector. Okay, I'll give it a name, so variable square equals that selector. And then I want to do something with that selected element. So this is where the manipulation side of jQuery comes in. Okay, so if I look at, okay, there's a whole section in the documentation for manipulation. So what I'm wanting to do is essentially remove one class, okay, remove the red class and add another class of green. So there's a function in here called remove class, and there's another function in here called add class. So I can use either of those. Well, I need to use both of those actually. So what I'll say is now I've selected that, I can say square dot remove class, and then in the parameters for this remove class function, I just give it the name of the class that I want to remove. So I want it to remove the red class. Okay, so if I run this, so I'll set that back to red, which is what it originally was. Okay, when I refresh this page, you should see this disappear. Okay, it's still there. In fact, what I'll do is I'll style the square so that it has a border so we can still see it. Okay, so the square is still there, but it's removed the class red, which is what was giving it its background color of red. Okay, and then as a next step, I'll tell it to do square dot add class, and then tell it to add the class of green. Okay, so there it does. So it's done it all in very quick succession. Okay, so all you see is it come up as green. But if we comment those out there, okay, and put them in line by line here into the console, then we should be able to see it work line by line. So I create my variable square, which selects the square inside of article 2. Okay, and then I will say square.remove class red. Okay, it goes to transparent, and then square.add class green. There we go. Okay, so you see that in very quick succession, so all you see is it come up as green, but actually it starts off as red and then turns to green. So that's how we select and then manipulate something. Now, I've written this as 3 separate lines, but I can do something with jQuery called chaining functions, which means that I can write this a bit more compactly. So what I can actually do is immediately after I do the selector, okay, I can call the function remove class, and then immediately after that I can call the function add class. So it basically just goes through left to right, doing one then the other then the other. Alright, and this will have the same effect. Okay, there we go. So now if it's easy for you to understand to actually create separate variables and then call them the other way, then I'm happy for you to write it like that as well. And essentially functionally identical, this to that. Okay, all the same, has the same effect. But this just requires that you write a bit less code, which is generally why you see people doing it. And you can chain that along as many times as you want. So let's just say, for example, I wanted to, after as well as adding the class red, I also want to adjust its width. Okay, there's a jQuery function called width. Okay, which if we pass it a value will set the width. Okay, this tells you that. If we pass it a value, it will set the width of the selected element to that value. So as well as, so after turning the square green, let's say I want to set the width to 200 pixels. Okay, then we can do that as well. Alright, and there we go. So it does all of those. And we can chain those together as many as we want. You could chain hundreds of those together if you wanted to. Okay, so this it gives us a very powerful way of manipulating, selecting and manipulating DOM elements with quite compact code. Now the other thing, so I mean we've only looked at a couple of things to manipulate. We've looked at classes and we've looked at changing the width, for example. Pretty much anything you could change with CSS, okay, you can manipulate and change with jQuery. Now we can manipulate other things though as well. So for example, this image here, okay, the way that an image is written in HTML is defined by its source attribute, its SRC attribute. Okay, now we can change attributes on HTML elements as well. We can change any attribute. All we're doing is changing the text value in here. So we could actually change the content of this picture by manipulating the source value of this image here. So what I'm going to do is just get a link to another image. Okay, so I'll just get something off Google, copy that image URL. Okay, and I'll say in my code, so here's my image here, okay, in article 2. So I'm going to select that. So change the image. So article 2 space img. Okay, so that's the image inside of, well, that's all images inside of article 2, but I only have one. And then to modify any attribute on an HTML element, I use a jQuery function called .attr, okay, short for attribute. And this takes two parameters. The first one is the name of the attribute that we want to change. In this case, it's the SRC attribute. And then the second parameter is what we want to change it to. So I'm going to paste the URL of that new image in there. Alright, so when I refresh this page now, you should see this image change to this image here. Okay, so I'll hit refresh. Alright, and there it is. Okay, it's a much bigger image. I haven't set the height and width of it or anything, but there it is there. So maybe if I want to constrain that size, then I can set the, let's say we'll set the width to 300 pixels after we've changed the image source. Okay, so again, I'm just chaining on the end of this big long selector here. There it is. Okay, so without it, we have the original. Alright, and I could paste this into the console. Okay, and it changes like that. So you could use something like this to create something like an image slider. Okay, but you'd probably want to, have some sort of interaction, or you could set it on a timer and have it change like that. So that's how we can modify attributes. Now we can also okay, we can also animate things. Okay, so so let's just say we want to animate this wrapper div. Okay, so I've got this div here called wrap, which basically contains everything, and it's 100% width div. Okay, or an auto width div. Now let's say I want to animate it so that it is half the size. Okay. Well, first of all, let's simplify that. Let's say let's just use jQuery to make it half the width of the page. So again, I'm going to need to start off by selecting that element. So hash wrap, and then I could say dot width is 50%. Okay, now when I refresh this, you should see it basically resize to half the size of the page. Okay, all right, and that will remain at 50%. Now I can animate this, okay, for example, by using a function, logically enough, called animate. So the animate function looks like this. Okay, so animate takes as its parameters actually an object. Now we can define an object using the curly braces, and then it takes a bunch of basically a bunch of CSS styles that you want to animate towards. So we can, for example, say animate towards a width of 50%. Okay, so let's just try that first of all. Oh, thanks. There we go. Okay, so you can see when I load the page, it now animates to that 50%. Now, we can animate as many different properties as we want here. Maybe we want to animate the opacity down to, let's say, 10% as well. So these are basically going to be any CSS properties that you would otherwise set on this. Okay, so this should animate now down to 10% opacity. Okay, and we can pass it another parameter, okay, after the end of this object definition. Okay, we can pass it another parameter which defines the duration. So it has a default duration. Okay, I should just look up the documentation for it. Okay, it has a default duration of, I think, 400 milliseconds. We'll mention that in here somewhere. Okay, but we can override that with our own. So let's say I want this to take a full 2 seconds to animate, then I can pass it 2000 milliseconds as the second parameter after the animation object there. Okay, and there we go, the animation takes full 2 seconds. Okay, so that's pretty cool, but normally all of these things that we've done, I mean, we haven't done anything useful yet. Normally you will do all these things in response to some sort of event. The whole reason that we use JavaScript is to be dynamic, is to be able to respond to different events. So that's the next thing that we'll look at. I'll just disable this animation for the moment. Let's just say, okay, let's just say for a simple example, when I click on these squares, I want them to fade out and disappear. Okay, so I can make my squares disappear by having a selector like this. So select the squares, and then have a function. There's a jQuery function called fade out. Okay, and again, you can specify the amount of time if you want that it takes to fade out. So fade out is basically a shortcut function for animation. So you could write this as an animation like I've done here, where you fade the opacity to 0, but fade out is a function which just sort of shortcuts that for you. Alright, so if I refresh this, you'll notice all my squares, okay, fade out, right, and disappear. But what I really want to do is I only want to do that in response to me clicking on one of them. Okay, so the way that I do that is by responding to events. Okay, and there's a whole section of the jQuery documentation called events. Okay, and so some of these are browser events. So things like you can trigger an event when you resize the window, or when you scroll, or when there's an error. There's document events. Okay, which is, we already looked at this one. Okay, this is an event which fires when the document is been fully loaded. Okay, but probably more usefully, we want to look at things like mouse and keyboard events. Okay, so I've got a mouse event here. I've got a bunch of mouse events here. So these are all the mouse events we can detect. There's click, double click, focus out, hover, mouse down, mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse move. Okay, all of these sorts of things. So the one I want to use is click. And all of these event handler objects are going to take the same basic structure. So what we'll do is, first of all, we start again with the selector. Okay, so I'll select all of the squares. Okay, and then we type the name of an event handler function. So in this case, .click. Now inside of this event handler function, the parameter that we actually pass it is a function definition, okay, which looks like this. And then we write our code inside of here. And basically whatever we write inside of here will only be executed when this event fires. Okay, so the parameter, so it might seem a little complicated, but the parameter that we're passing is actually a function definition. And that's exactly what we did up here with this document.ready function. Okay, so this is the selector selecting the entire document and then saying don't call this function until the ready event fires on the document. Okay, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Select all of the squares and don't do any of the code inside this function until the click event fires. Now this function is always passed an event object with information about the event that you might want to access inside of this function. So we can write that here, and you can call this whatever you want, but you'll often see it called event or EVT or just E, short for event. Okay, and that will contain information about the event itself. So I'll call it event. So just to test if this is working, what I'll do is do a console.log and then output that event object. Okay, so this should only execute this line of code when I click on any of those squares. Okay, so I'll refresh my page. All right, if we look over in the console here, I should see something output every time I click on a square. Okay, so this is what the event object looks like. It contains a whole bunch of information about the event. Okay, so there's a timestamp, so it tells you the exact time that it happened. It tells you the target, so which element actually triggered the event. And a whole bunch of other information, like where the mouse was when you clicked it, where the page was, all of these things. So that can contain useful information for us. If you don't need to use that event inside of your function, you don't need to include it there, but it doesn't harm it to have it there anyway. So we at least know that this click handler function is working. Okay, and it will fire off every time I click any one of these squares which I've applied that event handler to. So what I actually want to do though when I click on those squares is to fade them out, or fade the square out that I've clicked on. So we could do something like this. Okay, so select all of the square, all of the elements with a class of square and hit fade out. Okay, but that's going to do this. Okay, it's going to fade all of the squares out no matter which one I've clicked on. If I just want to target the one that I've clicked on, then we can modify our selector to look like this. Basically, we get rid of that there, and inside of those brackets we just write this. Now notice that I'm not putting that inside of inverted commas like this. Okay, this is actually a variable. So this actually refers to whichever one of these triggered the event. Okay, so if I say $this.fade out, then it will only fade out the one of these that triggered that click event. So I refresh that again, alright, and now when I click it should only fade out the one that I'm actually clicking on. Okay. Alright, and we could do other things like, for example, this do something button here. Okay, let's say rather than automatically changing this picture here, I only want to change it when I click this do something button. Okay, well it's going to be very similar. I'll select the button, so that button has an ID of, pretty sure it's just do underscore something. Do underscore something. Okay, and then add a click handler function. Okay, and what I want to do there is this line of code here, change the image. So I'm going to take that out from there and put it in here so it only happens when I click the do something button. So refresh the page, click on do something, okay, and there it's changed the source attribute of this. Right, and my other event handler is still working as well. So I can do a similar thing with this animation here. Really, the animation where I made it narrower, really that would be, again, something that you probably want to respond to some sort of button. So if we have expand and collapse buttons here, okay, then I can use those to trigger that animation. So we'll have the expand, and okay, so expand.click function, and I'll copy that animation code down into here. So actually this should be on contract. So on contract we want the opacity, sorry, we want the width to go to 50%. Let's say the opacity can go to 0.5 or something. Okay, and then I would do the same thing, write an event handler for expand, okay, which would call wrap.animate and set it back to the width to, well, let's set it to auto. Okay, and the opacity to 1. Alright, so let's see if this works. So I'll hit collapse. Oh, something's not working. Sorry, I put contract instead of collapse. That's what I actually want. So I'll hit collapse. Okay, there's that animation. We hit expand. Okay, and it goes back. Actually, I probably need to use 100% rather than auto there. So I'll use 100% there. So collapse down to 50%. And expand animates back up to 100% and opacity of 1. Okay, so that animate function, basically it's going animate these properties from whatever they are at the point that this is being triggered to these values. Okay, so that's why we can basically dynamically do that in response to these buttons and keep doing it as many times as we want. Okay, so now this here is probably a bit too slow to actually be kind of useful. So as a usability thing, I'd probably want to lower this down to something quite quick. Okay, this duration of the animations. Something more like that. Okay. So that is how we respond to events. And that is pretty much covers all of the basic things that we would want to do with jQuery. Yes, question.
If you clicked collapse twice,
yep.
Would it go down 50% and then go down another 50%?
No, it would stay where it is. So it would. So you can think of this as it's applying a CSS value, right? So the CSS value it's applying is width of 50%, and it's animating towards that. And so you click it again, and it's going to animate from 50% to 50%. Yeah. But if we had done something like, let's say we do something like this. So for the width, let's say we went animate the width down to, so to achieve something like you were saying, we'd say something like animate the wrap down to a width of what the wrap currently is, width divided by 2. I think something like that should work. So we'll see like that, and then again, and then so that will sort of halve it each time. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that pretty much covers the basics of jQuery. We select things, we manipulate things, and we usually do that in response to some event. So there's obviously a lot more different types of things we can manipulate and different things we can select, but basically, I mean, there's so many that I can't really cover it in a tutorial, but basically you search for them as you need them, and the documentation is where you'll find those. So what I'd like to do next is maybe just look at some more practical examples using the same using those same techniques and to achieve, you know, other results. So I've got one here. So if you remember last week, I had that page which sort of we stored information about people in objects, and then we used that information to calculate a person's BMI. So I want to extend that example a little bit today by allowing us to have that as user input. So I'll just create a new file here, because bmi.html. Okay, and I'm just going to copy some HTML across from the completed example. Let's just copy the whole thing and then I'll remove the bits I don't want. Okay, so I don't need that right now. Okay. Okay, so this example I've actually used Bootstrap just to make styling this a bit quicker. So I just have to copy that across as well. Okay, but that should be nothing really new. Okay, so this is what my interface looks like. At the moment, there's no JavaScript doing anything in here, but I've got some input fields. So a text input for my first name and last name, and then a number input field for my height and my weight, and then a submit button here. And the idea is when I hit submit, it will output the combination of my first and last name up here, and then do the BMI calculation and output that here. Okay, so we'll just have a look at the HTML to start with. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so this is the HTML. Most of this stuff is just Bootstrap formatting stuff, okay? But essentially there's a form, okay, and I've got some labels and inputs in here. The important thing to notice is that my inputs, I've all given them IDs, okay, to make them easily selectable by jQuery, okay? So my inputs are all first name input, last name input, height input, weight input, and then I've got in my output section down here a paragraph with an ID of name, so I can select that to output the name to the paragraph, and then another one with the ID of BMI. I've got some, I don't have them in there yet. Yep, sorry, I've got an external style sheet which I need to copy across. Okay, and which just has some styles for, so the idea is I'm going to style the BMI output red or green based on whether it's healthy or unhealthy range. Okay, and then some just other basic styles. And I'm going to, for this example, put my JavaScript file in, I'm going to put my custom JavaScript in an external JavaScript file, so call this script.js. Okay, so there's nothing in there at the moment. But the other thing is to notice what I've included. Okay, so I've included up here a link to Bootstrap style sheet, which is fine. Okay, we've already seen that we need to do that, including Bootstrap. A link to my style sheet. Okay, and down here, okay, I've included jQuery again, and Bootstrap. Now Bootstrap actually relies on jQuery, Okay, so even if you're just using Bootstrap, I don't know if you remember, but we had to include Jquery for that as well anyway. And because Bootstrap relies on Jquery, we have to include Jquery first and then Bootstrap. And then my script's going to rely on both Bootstrap and Jquery, so it has to come after that. Okay, and I'm just linking to this one here, my script.js, which at the moment has nothing in it. Okay, so I'm going to start off by typing my ready function again to make sure the code doesn't execute until the document is fully loaded. And I'm just going to copy across some of the functions that we already wrote last week to do some useful things for us. Okay, so I had a function called getFullName, which accepted as parameters the first and the last name and returned a string with the two names separated by a space. Okay, and then we had a function calculate BMI, which takes the height and the weight and then does the mathematical calculation to return a BMI. So I've modified this slightly to take a number in centimeters rather than meters, which is what we did last week. That's really the only difference, because my input is going to take a height in centimeters. Okay, so what we want to do is, so I'll just recap again. What we want to do is, when the user's entered a name and a height and a weight and has clicked submit, okay, we want to output their name here and we want to output their BMI here. So there's two ways that we could do this. We could put a click event on the submit button, or what's probably more correct is to put a submit event on the form itself. Okay, so so the form here, there it is there. So the form here can actually take an event called submit, and that means any way that the form's submitted, whether we click the submit button or we've hit return, then that event will fire. Okay, so we can see in, if we go back again to the jQuery documentation under events, okay, there's form events here. Okay, and there's one called submit. Okay, if we look at this, okay, we can see what the code looks like for that. Okay, now you'll notice that as part of the submit function, there's something we're going to have to do here. So this is a case where you do have to use the event object. And we have to do this thing where we call a function on the event object called prevent default. And the reason that we do that is a form is designed originally not to be used with JavaScript. It usually, you click the form and then it links to another page which processes the form data. So the default behavior of a form when you click submit is to actually go to another page, or if you haven't specified the page, to actually refresh the page. So if we do that, then our JavaScript's not going to execute. So what we need to do is include this event.preventDefault line here to basically stop that default behavior of the form submission happening and give our JavaScript a chance to run. But other than that, this is going to be exactly the same essentially as any other event handler. Okay, so I'll write the event handler. My form has an ID of user details. Okay, so I can select that, hash user details, and then the event handler, or the event that I want to create an event handler for, is called submit. And then again, I will create a function, pass the event object, and inside the curly brackets, I'll write the code that I want to execute when the form is submitted. So first thing I have to do is event.preventDefault. Okay, and I'll just copy the comment here from the completed example to remind us that basically if we don't do this, then the page will refresh, which we don't want. Okay, and what I'm going to do next, I'm just going to copy and paste this code to save a bit of time because it's stuff we've all done before anyway, really. Okay, so what I want to do is actually get the values from those input fields. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating some variables to store the values that have been entered into each of those input fields. So the way that I get those are again to do a selector, okay, for each of these imports, and then I'm using this function .val, so that will return whatever value has been entered into any of these, or each corresponding input field there. Now whether that's a text or whether it's a number doesn't matter, the value is going to return whatever value is in there. Okay, and after we have those, what we want to do is output the data. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is quite simple. We'll output the person's name. Okay, so what I want to do is first of all select where I want to output it to. Okay, and where I want to output it to is this paragraph here with the ID of name. Okay, so it's an empty paragraph, so you can't see it initially on the page, but it is there. Okay, just directly under here. So I will select that in my script. Okay, ID name, and then I'm going to call a function, a jQuery function called .html, and all that does is sets the content of this to whatever we specify inside of here. So if I just write a string in here, just testing, okay, then it doesn't really matter what I put in here, but I'll hit submit. Oh, sorry, I must have an error. Sorry, I put that in the wrong folder. My mistake. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Alright, so it doesn't really matter what I put in here. When I hit the submit button, okay, it's outputting just testing into that paragraph there. Okay, so I should be able to see it up here. I'll refresh the page again. Okay, there's the paragraph just sitting there. It's an empty paragraph with the ID of name. When I hit submit, okay, it's outputting, okay, the text just testing into that paragraph. What I really want to do though is output the name of my person. Okay, so the full name. So I can create a variable up here called full name equals, okay, and then remember this function here, the get full name function we wrote in order to, as a shortcut way of basically getting a full name from a first and a last name. So we'll call that function get full name and pass it the first name that we've pulled out of the input and the last name that we've pulled out of the input. Okay, and then that's what we'll output down here. Alright, so let's try that again. So I'll put my name in, hit submit, okay, and there we go, it outputs. If I write a different name in here, hit submit, okay, outputs that one. Okay, even if I leave one off, alright, it's just gonna, it's still gonna output, it's just gonna have nothing as the second name. Okay, so now we could just compact this and just call this like this. Okay, so we set the HTML to the return value of that function. Okay, it's going to have the same effect. Just a bit more compact way of writing it. Alright, but the more interesting thing we want to do is actually output the BMI. So we do need to do that calculation. So I'll create a variable called BMI, and then we'll call our calculate BMI function and pass it the values that we pulled out of the inputs for height and weight. Okay, and then we'll do pretty much the same thing we did here, okay, to output the BMI. So there's a paragraph here called BMI, which is just sitting there with that ID, which is empty. And we'll select that. So ID of BMI dot HTML equals, and then pass it the BMI. Okay, so obviously we're going to need some values in here for it to do that calculation. So I'll put something in here. Okay, and there we go, it outputs. So this is almost actually done, this example, but what I said is I wanted to style this a different color based on the value of this number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it like this. So I'm going to basically wrap this inside of a conditional if statement. So this is saying if the BMI is less than 20, or, okay, so these two characters here are pipe symbol, it means or. If BMI is less than 20 or the BMI is greater than 25, okay, then that's in the either underweight or overweight range. So I'll say if that BMI paragraph, remove the class green and add the class red. Okay, otherwise, with that paragraph, remove the class red and add the class green. Okay, so red and green are going to style it well, we'll see. So I've got those styles in here. Okay, red. So BMI is already styled so that the font is sort of larger and bold with some padding and stuff. Okay, but BMI.red will be will have red text and background and border, and green will have green text and background and border. So we'll apply one of those two classes depending on whether the value of BMI is between 20 and 25 or outside of that range. So I'll refresh this. Actually, it doesn't really matter if I enter my name in, but I'll just type my height and weight in. Okay, I'll hit submit. What's happened there? Something is happening.
Have you copied over the thing that's actually outputting the BMI number?
Oh, I did. Yes, I did. You are absolutely right. Well spotted. So I'll put that back in. So it's not actually outputting the number. Okay. And also the calculation. Equals. Yes. All right. Thank you for spotting that. All right. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so either way it will output the number, but it will apply a different style depending on whether that value is between 20 and 25 or outside of that range. So if I change my weight here to 100, okay, that becomes over 25, okay, and it outputs red. Same deal if I suddenly drop to 50, okay. Now what I'd really like to do with this is actually be able to see this update live as I change these values. Okay, so you'll notice because I made this a number input field, okay, it gives me these little buttons here. But I'd really like to be able to change this, and every time I change it, to update this without having to go back down and hit submit again. So what I can do is essentially this same function again, okay, but well, what I might do is actually pull this whole function out, okay, and say and actually give it a name, function, say process input. Okay, and then I can say for the submit event handler, use this function process input. Okay, but also use that function when any of my user details inputs. actually change. Okay, so there's a form event handler called change. Okay, and I can use, so that should be there. I can use process input for that as well. Okay, so let's see if this works. Okay, now anytime I change this, okay, it should work like that. Now, as you probably saw, it sort of did things before, you know, it did something as soon as anything changed. Okay, so what I can do is basically have it do the submit first, okay, and only use the change handler after submit has been clicked first. Okay, so what I can do is say put this one inside of actually no, maybe I won't overcomplicate this example, because I'd have to change this function as well. So another way of getting around that is to basically put another if statement in here, which says I can say only do this bit if height is greater than 0 and weight is also greater than 0. Alright, so if either of those, if I haven't filled out either of those inputs, okay, then this condition is going to be false, in which case it won't do any of the code here relating to calculating the BMI and outputting that. Okay, it will only do the name stuff. So that way I can still do this. Okay, and it will do my name, but it won't do any of this until both of these numbers have values in them. Okay, there we go. Alright, if I get rid of that, okay, it's not gonna change that anymore. Okay, so there's that example there. Again, we've used some more conditional statements, which we looked at last week, but again, it's the same deal. Okay, we're responding to events. Okay, we're creating an event handle object. We're selecting things, and then we're either retrieving information from them or we're outputting information to them. Okay, so in the bit of time that we have left, what I want to start to look at is the ways that we can extend jQuery by using plugins. So, as I did mention briefly, okay, as is on the week 7 notes, you can actually use jQuery plugins, which allow us to do various different things without too much effort on our own behalf. So, for example, a very common one is the lightbox technique. So, I'm sure you've all seen an example of that. I'm going to look at one called Fancy Box, which is just one of the variants of the original lightbox. Okay, but it's anything that looks like this, okay, where you have a link, and rather than opening something in a new window, it opens it up in a nice sort of gallery / slideshow thing like this. Okay, so Fancy Box is actually a jQuery plugin, and so basically you can get this effect on anything by simply including this plugin and then writing pretty much one line of JavaScript. Okay, so to code this yourself from scratch would be hundreds of lines of JavaScript. So there's a lot of common, I guess, implementations or interface elements or techniques that people use a lot, and therefore they've created a plugin for it, so that you don't have to go and create it from scratch every time. So I'll just quickly demonstrate how you might implement something like this. So again, the plugins themselves are just going to be more JavaScript code. Okay, so if I go to the download section here and click on download. Okay, so this is FancyBox, and it actually comes with a bunch of demos inside the folder itself. Okay, so like this. So you can look at that code and see how it works, but really the only files that you really need for this to work are the ones that are in this source folder here. And the only files that we need to include, I mean, all of this is going to be outlined on their documentation page. Okay, so it shows you the things that you need to add here. So it tells you, obviously being a jQuery plugin, it's going to need you to include the jQuery library first, which we already know how to do. There's an optional mouse wheel plugin which does something, I'm not sure, but we don't need to worry about that. And then this here are the things that you need, are the files that you need to add for FancyBox to work. So you'll notice there's just one CSS file and then there's one JavaScript file. Okay, and as you can see here, they're in that source folder. So they're really the only two files you need to care about for the basic FancyBox examples, and then it says here there's other helpers for various different content, but essentially that's all we need to include. So I can see there's the CSS file there, and there's the FancyBox JavaScript file there. So you notice that all of these jQuery plugins, they should always have the file name jQuery the name of the plugin .js. So that's the JS file that you're looking for to include. So I'll copy this across to my example folder. Actually, we might just have a look at the completed example here. Okay, so I've got FancyBox in here. I've got the Lightbox HTML demo page. So there's my inclusion of jQuery. Again, I'm using Bootstrap just for its styling, but this is the part where I'm including FancyBox. Okay, so in my project, it's in a folder called FancyBox, and then there's source, and then there's the CSS file and the JavaScript file there. Okay, so I'm linking to the CSS file, and then I'm doing a script with a source for the FancyBox JS file. Okay, and once you've done that, you've included the plugin in your project. And then the idea with these plugins is usually what you need to do is to set up your HTML code in a particular way, and then you simply just call a function of that plugin. Okay, and the documentation in these plugins will tell you what you have to do, and I've simply just modified this example from one of their examples here. Okay, but essentially what's important here, and I'll disable this code for a moment so we can see what it looks like without the JavaScript, and I'll open the file. Okay, so this is what it looks like with no JavaScript, just as an HTML page. Okay, there's some thumbnail images here, and they're all wrapped within A tags, okay, which link to a larger version of the image. Okay, so if I click on them, they just open up the large version of that image. Okay, so what FancyBox does is it looks through. Basically, all you have to tell FancyBox is which elements you want it to apply to. So that's the reason these anchor tags have a class of FancyBox here. Okay, FancyBox, FancyBox, all of them. And so what this code down here does, again, just inside a document.ready function, this here is simply just selecting all of those A tags with the class of FancyBox, and then it's calling the FancyBox function. Now I'll just remove this option here for a moment to show you the simplest version. Okay, you're just calling the function, and just by doing that, okay, it takes it from opening in a new link to giving you this functionality like this. Okay, and the only other thing you need to know about formatting the HTML for this example is this rel attribute. These are all gallery 1. So you could have multiple galleries on the same page, and and it uses this attribute to basically for you to tell it which images to include in which gallery. Okay, so if I had multiple images on this page, if I had multiple galleries on this page, it's that attribute which tells it to only cycle through these ones for one gallery and those ones for another gallery. Okay, now in terms of the options, which we have down here, so you know, most of these plugins have options for customizing them. And so FancyBox, if I look down here, has a whole bunch of options you can change, and it will tell you exactly what they do. So for example, you can set the width and the height of the overlay. Just very simply for this example, maybe I decide that I don't like this white border around my images. So in that case, I can pass the FancyBox call a object, okay, again in my curly braces, and I'll just set the padding option to be 0. Okay, and oops, sorry, I shouldn't have put that semicolon there. Okay, I set the padding to be 0, alright, and they just come up with none of that white padding around them. Okay, so it's no point me sort of going through every different variation of every different plugin here, but the process is generally that. You include the plugin file, you set up your HTML usually in a certain way in which they tell you, and then you usually make one call to that plugin's function and then optionally pass it some options. And these plugins will generally always have good examples of, you know, what it looks like, along with the HTML code that you need and then the JavaScript code that you need. So it's quite easy just to take one of these examples, paste that code into your thing, and then modify it to suit your needs. Even if it's as simple as taking this gallery and then just replacing the links to actually the images that you want to use. Okay, so now in terms of other plugins, another one that is useful to have a look at is Jquery Ui. So Jquery Ui is actually kind of a suite of plugins. It's a bunch of plugins all put together, and they're all designed to sort of in similar categories. So I guess it's easiest if we just look at the website. So Jquery Ui, I guess, is designed to extend Jquery with sort of more unusual interactions for one part. So we can see the examples of all these over here. So for example, if you want sort of drag and drop sort of things, okay, Jquery Ui makes that quite easy. And again, you can see examples here and view the source code and see how they've done it. And all that they do to implement this, I mean, other than, again, you'll have to download the files here and include those, and any CSS that you'll need to include. But essentially all it's doing here is it's got a div, and it's given an ID of draggable, and then it's got a script here which has selected that draggable div, and then simply just called a function called .draggable, okay, and then it just takes care of everything else. It makes this draggable then, okay, and you can extend that with various more complex examples. So this one, for example, you can make it only drag vertical or horizontal if you want. You can contain it within another container, or a parent object. Okay, all sorts of things. All examples down this side. You can see droppable. So if you want to do drag and drop stuff, again, this stuff will be, you know, will be a nightmare to code by yourself. So, so this saves you a lot of time. Okay, so it's draggable, droppable. You can make elements resizable easily. selectable, sortable. All right, and there's all different variations of these. So that's the interactions that's the interaction plugins that it extends, and then it's also got these widgets as well. So widgets are like sort of extra interface components that don't exist already in HTML. So you've got easy ways of making an accordion, for example, extending text fields with autocomplete functionality, like that. Okay, this date picker one's pretty cool. So it takes what would normally be just a text field here, in which you'd have to type a date, like, you know, that sort of thing, to giving you, when you click on it, a nice visual selector like this. Okay, so all those sorts of things, progress bars, tabs, easy ways of implementing tabs, that kind of thing. So if you have sort of, though, if you want to implement those sort of interface components, rather than creating that from scratch, if someone's already done it, I mean, that's going to save you quite a bit of time if you just sort of figure out how to include the plugin. It also extends the effects a bit, so you can do things like color animation, which you can't really do in normal jQuery. So as well as animating the dimensions of something, you can transition between colors. So a whole bunch of stuff, and the best way to look at that is just to look through the demos, but I guess we should look at how to actually include it. So if you go to this download link, as you can see here, you can include all or just select parts of this. So to make your file size smaller, if all you really care about is the draggable and droppable stuff, then you only really need to download those two particular things. Okay, or maybe you just want the accordion widget. So you can just select the bits that you need and then click download here, and it will download a customized version of the plugin for you. You can also customize the theme. So there's a default look for these sorts of things, but you can change the look. So maybe the default theme doesn't actually suit the aesthetic of your project. So you can come in here and either select pre-designed themes from a gallery, or you can modify these themes any way you want as well. It's got a nice visual interface for this. So let's say maybe you like this theme, but you just don't, I mean, orange is not part of your color scheme. So you come in here and change this color to something which suits you a bit better. It's being a bit annoying for me here, but okay, let's just say you want to change it to blue. Okay, and you change all sorts of things, fonts and overlays and, you know, textures and blah 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 blah, okay, etc. So you can do all that, and once you've customized it to how you want, you go back to download the theme here, and we'll bring you back to this page with a link to your custom theme. Okay, and you can call that what you want. So I can call this Dave theme. All right, and then you download that. Downloads a file. Okay, again, looks something like this. Let's wait for it to load. Still loading. Anyway, I'll just ignore that one for now because I've got a version that's already downloaded. But anyway, in a completed example here, you can see, so this is what the Jquery Ui folder will download, what it looks like. So there's a JS folder, okay, which has the Jquery Ui JavaScript file. They also include their own jQuery here, so you don't need to keep including jQuery multiple times. Okay, they just include that in case you don't already include it in your project. But one of these files is the one you want. Again, there's a minified version and a normal version, so you include either or of those files, and you'll need to include also probably their CSS file. And the CSS folder is divided into themes, so you can install multiple themes for this. but anyway, there's your CSS file as well. So there's a Jquery Ui file that Cassie's done up and as part of the completed examples, and I'll put all this code up at some point. But as you can see there's again, I'm doing the same thing, including jQuery, and then including jQuery UI, which is simply linking to the style sheet for the theme, okay, and then also linking to one of those JavaScript files. Okay, so we can see what this, and I mean, you can look through this code and see what it does. It's just a combination of a bunch of these different effects, but we'll have a look at it in the browser. Okay, and you can see it's a combination of these things. So we've got the draggable thing, make it a bit bigger, the draggable thing with a drop target, a resizable widget, selectable, and the sortable thing, and there's a date picker up here as well. Okay, so there's that code there which you can look through, but again, really the best way of figuring out how to use this sort of thing is to look at the demos. These are all very good, and show you the code required for all of these under the view source. So it's quite easy just to take this code and copy and paste it and then modify the content for how you need it to look. Now I will say one thing about the jQuery UI in terms of its widgets here. If you're already using Bootstrap, then it actually contains a bunch of widgets and plugins already. So if you look under the JavaScript section of the Bootstrap website, okay, you'll see it will list a whole bunch of things that it gives you. So for example, it gives you modal dialogues. Let's see if we can find something that's also in jQuery UI. Okay, so there's a collapsible section, which is essentially jQuery UI's carousel. Okay, so I mean, if this one's already in Bootstrap and you're already using that, there's probably no reason to go and get the one from jQuery UI as well. There's a carousel, so that section was collapsed, and this one's carousel. So you might decide that this is an appropriate image slider for your, you know, for your application, and maybe you don't actually need to go and include a Lightbox plugin as something separate. And again, all of these examples have the HTML code that you need and any JavaScript code that you need as well. So just to show you that incorporated into one of these examples, here's the Bmi example again. Let's open this up. Alright, the Bmi example again, and now rather than just not doing anything if these aren't filled out, it actually pops up, you know, a nice little modal dialogue saying that it couldn't calculate the BMI. Please select appropriate values for height and weight and try again. And so I do that and then hit submit. Okay, and it works. Get rid of that. It doesn't work. Okay, so the way I've added this is, and I literally, when I was adding this, just went to that section of the Bootstrap website. Okay, copied and pasted this code and then modified the content to suit what I need. So I modified that, and I changed these buttons to just one button that says OK. And then it also says down here about how to trigger that, because you can either trigger it using a link on the page, but I actually needed to trigger it via the JavaScript. And again, all you do is simply select the element which defines your modal dialog. So if I look at my code here, so I've pasted this modal dialog code in there, and it's in the page all the time. It's just hidden by Bootstrap until you call it. Okay, so I've pasted that there. It's got an ID of my modal. And so if I go back over to my script file, okay, then here it is here. So I've just modified this. I've modified this if statement where I checked if the height and the weight values actually existed and were greater than 0. And I've just added an else onto that to say, well, if they're not, if we don't have both of those, then trigger this modal. So I'm selecting that my modal, okay, that div with the ID of my modal, and then I'm just calling the modal function like the Bootstrap documentation told me to, and that's how it pops up as this. Okay, so yeah, if you're using Bootstrap, it's worth looking through what Bootstrap already has to offer in terms of those things. But also you can include any other jQuery plugins. Now, in terms of finding other jQuery plugins, there's a whole section on jQuery.com of plugins, okay, which lists a whole bunch of them. So you can search for them there. So, like, I mean, there's 121 listed here that are just slideshow plugins, okay, and these will all have pages where you can, look at a demo, view the code. So I'm going to do something like this. Okay, so this is a video gallery, for example. Okay, so if you want something like that. So this is a good place to come to find any of these things. So if there's something that, especially if there's something you're trying to do which you've seen before, then there's a good chance that there's probably a plugin for it. So there's that there. There's obviously Googling for jQuery plugins. There's a few more listed on the on my blog here. Okay, Cassie's listed off a few here. So there's various different jQuery lightboxes. There's this one here. Looks like it implements parallax scrolling for you. Somehow, I'm not sure how that's a good demo of parallax scrolling, but anyway. Apparently it is. Okay, so apparently this plugin will implement parallax scrolling for you. And again, I mean, all you're really doing is putting in the code that they tell you to. What else have we got here? Don't know what this does. Let's find out. Okay, here's another parallax scrolling. Okay, this one actually has a better demo of what that looks like. Okay, so it seems like a lot of people are really into parallax scrolling at the moment, so undoubtedly there will be a bunch of plugins which do that for you. What else have we got? Sticky elements. Okay, so I guess that's that sort of effect there. Custom scrolling directions. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Okay, so different layout ones. Okay, this one, these type of plugins here, I might just look up masonry because I know that one. So masonry jQuery. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Pinterest layout, how it sort of puts its things in a grid. So masonry is a plugin which basically will do that for you as well. So you just give it a bunch of div objects and then call a function, I imagine. Okay, like this, and then it will lay them all out in a Pinterest style layout for you. See if there's any more examples of this. No. Anyway, that does that. And then there's various ones for interpreting swipe gestures as well, I guess, for touchscreens. Now that just reminds me there's something I should mention about jQuery Ui, which Cassie has actually put in here. jQuery UI is actually not designed for touch interfaces. They're working on a new version which is, but in the meantime you can get it to work on touch interfaces by using an additional plugin called Touch Punch here, which basically wraps all of the touch events into mouse events, and so this will actually let all your jQuery UI widgets and events work, in theory anyway, on a touchscreen device as well. So yeah, there's a bunch of them. There's there's more plugins than you could list out there for jQuery that do all sorts of different things. So I guess my advice is, if you're trying to do something that seems like a lot of work, check first if there's a jQuery plugin for it, because that will probably save you a lot of time if you're not having to code everything from scratch. Now, just to finish up in terms of where to go from here to look at jQuery a bit more, I'd recommend again, as I recommended last week for JavaScript, looking at Code Academy's website. So they have a section on jQuery. So go to Learn here. Section on jQuery, which again provides sort of interactive little lessons on implementing various different stuff in jQuery. Might explain some of the things or demonstrate some of the things I've talked about today a bit better, or in it'll deliver it to you in smaller chunks that are easier to understand. So I'd recommend going through that. In terms of Lynda tutorials or Lynda videos, I've had a look at some of those, and they're quite good. There's one in particular that I would recommend. I'd recommend this one, jQuery for web designers. That's probably quite good at explaining jQuery for the level that you probably need it. There's also, but there's a few more in here. There's also one about all about jQuery UI in here somewhere. jQuery UI widgets. I haven't looked at that, but if you're particularly interested in that, that might be worth a look. And then, of course, obviously, again, just the jQuery website, and Googling things. If you just Google jQuery and then the thing that you're trying to do, you'll likely find a lot of solutions. Okay, so now again, how relevant this might be to your project is up to you to decide, and so where you direct your effort from here is kind of a little bit up to you. But also, I think just generally having, as is JavaScript, I think having a working knowledge of jQuery is a very useful general skill for a web designer today, and even more so going into the future to have. So it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile regardless of how much you plan to use it for your assignment, to have some understanding of it, I think.